The milk foam had to be mathematically perfect. It wasn't enough for it to be hot. It had to be heated to exactly 140 degrees Fahrenheit. If the digital thermometer read 141, my brother Draven would pour the entire cup into the trash can right in front of me. But the temperature wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the foam thickness. Draven insisted that the foam on his morning latte be exactly 2 centimeters thick. No more, no less. He would actually stick a wooden stirrer into the cup, mark the line with his thumb, and hold it up to the light like a scientist measuring a toxic sample. If it was off by a millimeter, he would scream. I stood in the break room, the low mechanical hum of the industrial espresso machine drowning out the sound of the relentless city rain battering the window pane. It was a gray, miserable Tuesday in November, the kind of day that soaked into your bones. I stared at my reflection in the polished chrome of the steamer, and I hated what I saw. My suit was a calculated disaster. The jacket was a moth-eaten, oversized gray monstrosity that I had salvaged from a donation bin 3 years ago. The shoulders drooped halfway down my arms, and the sleeves covered my knuckles, making my hands look small, weak, and incapable. I looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's closet. My name is Radley. I'm 28 years old, adopted, and according to the ironclad terms of my late father's will, I am the permanent executive assistant to the family business, Vanguard Tech. To the board of directors, I am a mistake. I am the charity case they keep around to fetch dry cleaning, scrub coffee stains, and take the blame for copier jams so I can access my tiny monthly trust fund allowance. To them, I am slow, unambitious, and barely competent enough to tie my own shoes. They see the baggy suit and the slumped shoulders, and they see a loser. A burner phone buzzed deep in the pocket of my baggy trousers. I didn't reach for it immediately. I glanced up at the security camera mounted in the corner. I knew the building's security system better than the head guard did. The server backed up to the cloud every 10 minutes, causing a 3-second lag in the recording feed at exactly 7:58 a.m. I watched the seconds tick by on the microwave clock. 7 hours 57 minutes and 58 seconds. 7 hours 57 minutes and 59 seconds. 7 hours and 58 minutes. Quickly, I pulled the phone out. One secured message popped up on the cracked screen. Wire transfer complete. Debt package acquired. Account status, verified. A slow, cold grin spread across my face. It was the first real, genuine smile I'd allowed myself in 5 years. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, picked up the silver serving tray, and let my shoulders slump forward into the submissive posture of a beaten dog. It was time to play the part one last time. I pushed open the heavy double oak doors of the boardroom. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling of cold sweat, burned coffee, and the overpowering musk of expensive cologne mixed with damp wool. The room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn tight to block out the gray morning, focusing all attention on the massive projection screen at the front of the room. Draven was pacing the length of the 20-foot table. He looked like a caged animal that sensed the slaughterhouse was near. His silk tie was loosened aggressively at the collar, and his hair, usually plastered down with expensive gel, was starting to fray at the edges, sticking up in wild tufts. On the giant wall screen, a bright red arrow pointed straight down. Vanguard Tech stock price was in freefall, plummeting faster than a stone in water. Rumors of the bankruptcy had leaked an hour ago, and the market was reacting violently. He spun around when he heard the door click. His face was slick with a sheen of oily panic, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He hadn't slept in days. I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath from across the room. "You're late," he shrieked, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. I glanced at the digital clock mounted on the wall. It blinked 8:02 a.m. I was 2 minutes late. "Do you know what today is, you useless leech?" He marched over and snatched the porcelain cup from my tray. He grabbed it with such violent force that some of the hot liquid sloshed over the rim and splashed onto my exposed wrist. The scalding milk burned my skin, leaving an angry red mark, but I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I was used to the burns. They were just fuel for the fire I was about to light. "We are bleeding cash, Radley. If we lose this deal with Omega Group because you can't work a coffee machine faster, I swear I will destroy whatever pathetic life you have left." He took a loud, aggressive slurp of the latte, grimacing as if it tasted like poison. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of foam on his cheek. "And fix your tie. It's crooked. You look like a hobo." I don't want the buyers to think we run a homeless shelter here." The other board members began to file in, a sad, defeated parade of gray suits and grim faces. These were men and women who had known my father for decades. They had watched me grow up in his shadow, playing on the floor of this very office with toy trucks while my father built an empire. Yet, as they entered the room today, I became invisible to them. I was less than a ghost. I was furniture. Mrs. Albright, the head of HR, walked in first. She was dripping wet from the rain, her expensive blowout ruined by the weather. She handed me her soaking wet umbrella without even making eye contact, shaking the cold water onto my scuffed shoes. "Dry this off, Radley, and take it to the coat room. Don't let it drip on the Persian carpet, or it's coming out of your allowance." Mr. Draycott followed, dropping his heavy wool trench coat into my sagging arms as if I were a wooden coat rack. "Coffee, Black, and be quick about it. My head is splitting, and I don't have time for your incompetence today." They all knew Draven was running the company into the ground. They knew he was a cruel bully who had spent the company's reserves on personal trips, luxury cars, and bad gambling habits. I had overheard Mrs. Albright whispering about Draven's erratic behavior in the elevator just last week. But they didn't care. They were cowards. They were just here for the lifeboat, the buyout check that would let them retire to their beach houses in Florida before the ship completely sank. They took their places around the massive table, adjusting their expensive watches and shuffling papers nervously. Draven sat at the head, tapping his gold pen impatiently on the polished wood. I walked past the comfortable leather executive chairs to the far corner of the room. There, pushed right against the wall, was a small, rusted metal folding chair. It was my designated spot. I set the serving tray down on a side table and sat on the metal chair. I pulled out a cheap notepad and rested it on my knees, ready to take minutes for a company that wouldn't exist tomorrow. "All right, listen up," Draven started, clapping his hands together once loudly. The sound echoed in the tense room, making Mr. Draycott jump in his seat. "As you know, today is the day we save Vanguard Tech. The paperwork is finally ready for the sale to Omega Group." A murmur of unease went through the room. Nobody knew who Omega Group really was. They were a ghost entity, a mysterious private equity firm that had appeared out of nowhere last month offering an all-cash buyout. They had no website, no public office, just a massive bank account and a relentless, predatory desire to buy distressed assets. Draven puffed out his chest, looking pleased with himself despite the chaos. "It wasn't easy, but I managed to negotiate a killer deal. I had to really twist their arms to get the valuation we wanted. They played hardball, but I played harder. I bent my head over my notepad to hide my face. That was a complete lie. Omega Group, my group, had offered a flat price. It was a take-it-or-leave-it offer, and Draven had practically begged to take it within 4 minutes of the offer arriving via email. He was desperate. He had debts he hadn't told the board about, debts to dangerous people that were coming due by noon today. I knew this because I had been reading his emails for 6 months. "My sources tell me the head of Omega is likely some foreign oil billionaire," Draven continued, leaning back in his chair and spinning the gold pen between his fingers. "Someone who needs a brilliant American CEO to run things locally. I fully expect them to keep me on to steer the ship. They're buying the brand, but they're paying for the leadership." I jotted down on my pad, "Current CEO is delusional." A small, secret smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. He had no idea the foreign billionaire was sitting 10 feet away on a rusty metal chair, wearing a suit that smelled like mothballs. The meeting shifted rapidly from business to Draven's favorite topic, himself. He started listing exactly what he was going to do with his 8-figure payout once the wire transfer hit. It was grotesque. He spoke about money with the hunger of a man who had never actually earned a dime of it himself, only inherited it and squandered it. "I'm thinking a new 90-foot yacht," he said, looking at the ceiling tiles as if visualizing it floating there. "I'll call it the Titan. And definitely that villa in Monaco I showed you, Draycott. I need a break from this city. I need to be somewhere where people understand quality." He spun his expensive leather chair around to face my lonely corner. A nasty, predatory smirk played on his lips. He needed to kick someone to feel tall, and I was the designated target. "But hey, don't worry, little brother. I'm sure I can put in a good word for you with the new owners." The board members turned to look at me, their faces blank and uninterested. They sipped the coffee I had made, completely indifferent to my humiliation. They were complicit in their silence, trading my dignity for their comfort. I looked at Mrs. Albright, remembering how she used to give me candy when I was 10. Now, she wouldn't even give me eye contact. Maybe they'll keep you on as head janitor. Draven laughed, a cruel, barking sound that echoed in the quiet room. You'll need the health insurance, right? Since your little trust fund barely covers your rent in that rat-hole studio apartment you live in. A few of the older board members chuckled nervously, unwilling to upset the volatile CEO on payday. I just nodded slowly, keeping my eyes focused on my notepad. Thank you, Draven, I said quietly, making my voice sound small and beaten. That's very generous of you to think of my future. He didn't hear the sarcasm. He never did. He was too in love with the sound of his own voice to hear the dagger hidden in mine. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment the attorney for Omega Group cleared his throat. He sat at the far end of the table, a sharp-looking man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Beside him sat a sleek black briefcase. Draven stood up, buttoning his jacket to hide the sweat stains that were blooming under his arms. He walked to the wall and dimmed the overhead lights with a dial, plunging the room into semi-darkness so the projector screen would pop. He picked up a remote control from the podium. Now, before we sign, I want to show the Omega representative the trajectory of our synergy strategy. As you can see, Draven boasted, pointing to the screen, Vanguard's assets are prime for expansion. We are lean, we are mean, and we are ready for growth. He aimed the remote at the laptop and clicked the next button. I sat in the corner, my hand resting casually in my pocket. My thumb brushed the screen of my phone. I didn't need to look. I knew exactly where the icon was. I remembered the night I installed the backdoor. I had come in at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago, dodging the cleaning crew. I had physically accessed Draven's laptop while it was updating, mapping the presentation software to pull from a hidden folder I had created on the shared drive. I pressed the button on my phone screen. Suddenly, the screen flickered violently. Instead of the polished financial graph Draven expected, the screen turned a stark, brutal white. A messy spreadsheet popped up. It wasn't a glitch. It was a credit card statement. The text was large enough for everyone to see. Rows of bold numbers were highlighted in yellow. MGM Grand Casino, $50,000. Sapphire Gentlemen's Club, $15,000. Private Jet Charter Cancun, $35,000. Online gambling deposits, $22,000. The room went dead silent. The projection clearly showed the massive gambling debts and personal vices Draven had been funding with the company's emergency cash reserves. Draven froze. His face turned a deep, blotchy purple. He looked at the confused board members, then at the impassive lawyer. Panic took over his brain like a virus. He smashed the button on the remote, trying to advance the slide, but I had locked the system. The evidence of his theft remained frozen on the 20-foot screen, glowing like a neon accusation in the dim room. He needed a scapegoat fast. He spun around, his fingers stabbing the air in my direction. "You incompetent idiot," he roared, his voice shrill. "You loaded the wrong file. I told you to update the slide deck this morning." I hadn't touched the computer during the meeting, but I looked up, feigning shock and fear. I loaded exactly what was in the folder, Draven. That file was labeled Q4 expenses. I just did what you asked. "Liar," he screamed. He ran to the laptop sitting on the podium and slammed the lid shut. The projector cut off instantly, plunging the room into the dim, shadowy light of the overcast morning. "You are trying to sabotage me. You're jealous because I'm the CEO and you're nothing. You're a mistake." He was unraveling. The board members were exchanging nervous glances. Mrs. Albright looked pale, her hand clutching her pearl necklace. They had suspected he was mismanaging funds, but seeing it in black and white was different. This was embezzlement. This was exactly what I needed. Draven losing control in front of a witness. "I am talking to you, Radley." Draven screamed, realizing I wasn't cowering enough to satisfy his rage. He felt small in front of the Omega lawyer, so he needed to make me feel smaller. He needed to reassert dominance violently. He grabbed a heavy stack of blue file folders from the table, the hard copies of the merger contracts. They were thick, bound with heavy metal clips. With a grunt of pure frustration, he hurled them across the room. They flew through the air like heavy, blunt birds. The corner of the top folder struck me hard in the center of my chest, knocking the breath out of me. The rest of the stack exploded on impact, sending hundreds of white pages fluttering down around me like a snowstorm of legal jargon. The sharp sting on my chest throbbed, calling back a sudden, sharp memory of being 12 years old, when Draven had thrown a baseball at my stomach because I dropped a catch. The pain was the same. The look in his eyes was the same. Pick them up. Draven shrieked, his chest heaving, saliva flying from his mouth. He pointed at the floor, his eyes bulging. Right now. Look at this mess you made. You are pathetic. You can't even sit in a chair without ruining everything. I looked down at the scattered papers. The Omega lawyer shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. He adjusted his glasses, watching the scene closely, but he didn't intervene yet. He was waiting for my signal. He knew the plan. I slowly set my notepad down and slid off my metal chair. I knelt on the thin carpet, reaching for the papers. The humiliation was part of the plan, but that didn't make it burn any less. Every second I spent on my knees was a second I would make Draven pay for later. The carpet felt rough under my fingertips, a gritty texture that reminded me of how low I had allowed myself to sink to get to this moment. As I crawled around the floor gathering the sheets, Draven didn't stop. He walked over and stood directly above me, looming like a tower. He was performing now, putting on a show for the board to prove he was the dominant alpha in the room. Honestly, Dad made a huge mistake adopting you, Draven sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He thought he was doing a good deed, bringing in a stray from the system. But look at you. You've been a leech on this family for 20 years. I paused, my hand hovering over a page of the contract. This was his favorite insult. He loved reminding me that he was blood, and I was just paper. He loved reminding me that I wasn't really a vanguard, just a pretender who happened to share the last name. You are just the assistant, Radley, he continued, kicking a piece of paper toward my hand with the toe of his expensive Italian shoe. And the sad part is, you can't even do that right. You walk around in that clown suit, drinking my coffee, living off the trust fund my father was too weak to cut off. You're lucky I even let you into this building. If it were up to me, you'd be on the street. The board members looked away, studying their fingernails or the grain of the wood table. They were embarrassed, not for me, but for the awkwardness of the scene. They just wanted the money. They didn't care if my dignity was the price of the transaction. They were willing to let me be the sacrifice if it meant their checks cleared. I memorized every face that looked away. I would remember their silence. Are you listening to me? Draven shouted down at the back of my head. Apologize to the board. Apologize for being a waste of space. I reached for the last piece of paper. It was the signature page for the sale. My hand was steady, surprisingly steady, as I placed it on top of the neat stack I had reassembled. I remained on my knees for a second longer than necessary, letting the image of my submission burn into everyone's mind. Specifically, into the lawyer's mind. I said apologize. Draven barked, his voice echoing off the walls. I'm sorry, I said softly, standing up slowly. I kept my eyes low. I'm sorry that the file was revealing. Draven's eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure if that was an insult, but before he could scream again, a deep voice cut through the toxic air. Mr. Draven. It was the lawyer from Omega Group. He hadn't opened his briefcase yet. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands clasped on the table. His voice was calm, contrasting sharply with Draven's hysteria. Draven snapped his head around, his anger instantly replaced by a sycophantic smile. It was sickening how fast he switched masks. 1 second he was a tyrant, the next he was a groveling salesman. Yes, my apologies for the interruption. Good help is so hard to find, as I'm sure you know. It's hard to find competent people these days. We can proceed with the signing now. We cannot, the lawyer said simply. He checked his wristwatch, a Patek Philippe that likely cost more than Draven's car. The buyer has arrived. They are in the building and are ready to finalize the acquisition personally. Draven blinked, confused. Personally? I thought we were just signing with you. I didn't know the principal investor was coming here. He nervously straightened his jacket, running a hand through his hair. Well, that's fantastic. I'm ready to meet him. Is it the gentleman from Dubai? Or the group from Zurich? I want to make sure I greet him properly. The lawyer didn't answer the question. He just stared at Draven with a look of mild distaste, as if he were looking at something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Draven went into full panic mode again. He looked around the messy boardroom. He looked at the half-drunk coffee cups. Then his eyes landed on me, still holding the stack of papers, standing in my ill-fitting gray suit. You, he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. You heard him. The owner is coming. I am not going to let a billionaire investor see you looking like that. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper, so the lawyer wouldn't hear. Get out. Go wait in the hallway. Better yet, go wait by the service elevator. I don't want you seen. You're an embarrassment to this company and to this family. He grabbed the stack of organized files from my hands, roughly pulling them away. I'll handle the meeting. You just disappear. That's what you're best at anyway. He pointed aggressively toward the double glass doors. Now, move. I looked at the doors. I looked at the board members who were watching me with pity. Then I looked at Draven, whose face was flushed with the anticipation of his big payday. He thought he was minutes away from total victory. He thought he had won. He had no idea he had just given his final order. I stood completely still. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a jet engine in the quiet room. Draven was still pointing at the door, his face twisted in an ugly sneer, waiting for me to scurry away like a frightened mouse. But my feet felt rooted to the floor. For the first time in 5 years, my posture straightened. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the tension pop. The assistant mask was slipping, and underneath, something harder was emerging. Did you hear me? Draven barked, his patience snapping. I said get out. Move. I didn't move toward the door. I checked my watch. 8:15 a.m. Perfect timing. Radley. Draven screamed. Security is going to drag you out of here by your hair. I unbuttoned the top button of my oversized gray jacket. What are you doing? Draven asked, recoiling in confusion. Stop it. Just leave. I unbuttoned the second button. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I didn't blink. I didn't look down. Actually, I said. My voice wasn't the soft mumble I usually used. It was deep, clear, and carried a weight that made Mrs. Albright jump in her seat. I think I'll stay. The meeting can't start without me. Draven's mouth fell open. He looked around at the board members, letting out a short, confused laugh. What did you say? Have you lost your mind? Get out before I call security. I am not leaving, I repeated calmly. Draven's face went from confused to furious in a second. Excuse me? Are you deaf? You are fired. You hear me? Fired. Now get out. I ignored him completely. It was as if he were a ghost I couldn't hear. I started walking, but I didn't turn toward the exit. Instead, I walked deeper into the room. I moved with a slow, predatory grace that they had never seen from me before. My footsteps were heavy and rhythmic on the hardwood perimeter of the room. Clack, clack, clack. I walked past my little metal folding chair in the corner without even glancing at it. I kicked it slightly as I passed, sending it clattering against the wall. The noise was sharp and final, a bell tolling the end of an era. I walked past the coffee station where I had spent thousands of hours brewing lattes for people who didn't know my name. I trailed my hand along the polished table, feeling the texture of the wood. It felt different now. It felt like mine. I walked past Mr. Draycott, who pulled his legs in as if he were afraid I might bite him. I locked eyes with Mrs. Albright. She gasped, her hand going to her throat. She recognized the look in my eyes. It was the same look my father used to have before he fired someone, a look of absolute resolution. Every eye in the room followed me. They were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the assistant disobeying the CEO. I could feel Draven's gaze burning into my back as I moved toward the front of the room, toward the power. I reached the head of the table, right where the empty chairman's seat was waiting. It was a massive, high-backed leather chair, reserved strictly for the buyer from Omega Group. Draven stepped forward, his fists clenched. What do you think you are doing? Get away from there. That is for the new owner. He looked at the Omega lawyer, desperate for help. Counselor, tell him. Tell this idiot to leave before the buyer walks in. The lawyer didn't speak. He just watched me with a small, respectful nod. He closed his folder and waited. I gripped the back of the leather chair. It felt cool and solid under my hand. With a smooth motion, I pulled it out. The sound of the wheels rolling on the floor echoed in the silence. Radley. Draven screamed, his voice cracking. I am warning you. That chair is worth more than your life. Move. Mrs. Albright finally spoke up, her voice trembling. Radley, please. Just go. Don't make a scene. You're scaring us. I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I was focused entirely on the chair. I sat down. I didn't just sit, I settled in. I leaned back, resting my arms on the armrests, looking comfortable for the first time in a decade. Then, I did something that made Draven stop breathing. I shrugged my shoulders and peeled off the oversized, moth-eaten gray jacket. I draped it carelessly over the back of the expensive leather chair. Underneath, I wasn't wearing a baggy shirt. I was wearing a custom-tailored Egyptian cotton white dress shirt, fitted perfectly to my frame. It was crisp, expensive, and commanded respect. On my wrists, gold cufflinks caught the ambient light from the window. I wasn't the slouching assistant anymore. Even though I was still wearing the cheap frayed trousers, they were hidden behind the massive mahogany table. From the waist up, I looked like the most powerful man in the room. I pushed off the floor and slowly swiveled the chair around until I was facing Draven and the stunned board members. I crossed my legs and locked eyes with my brother. The silence in the room was absolute. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out. A pin drop would have sounded like a cannon blast. The board members stared at me with their mouths hanging open. "The buyer is here, Draven," I said, my voice steady and cold. Draven looked at the door, then back at me, his eyes darting around wildly. "What? Where? You're blocking the seat. Get up." "No," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You aren't listening. I said the buyer is here." I gestured to myself, placing a hand on my chest. "I am Omega Group." Draven stared at me for a long time, his brain trying to process the words. Then, he let out a loud, nervous laugh. "You." He pointed at me, shaking his head. That's hilarious. "You? You're broke, Radley. You live in a studio apartment the size of a closet. You wear suits that don't fit. You fetch coffee. You don't have $10, let alone 10 million. He turned to the board, grinning wildly. He's having a breakdown. The stress finally got to him. Someone call security. He thinks he's a billionaire. I didn't shout. I simply reached out my hand toward the lawyer. Without a word, the lawyer slid a leather portfolio across the table. I caught it and opened it calmly. I pulled out a single blue document and placed it on the table. "I live in a studio apartment because I invest every single dollar I have," I said. "Open it." Draven looked down at the document, hesitating. His hands were shaking. "Remember 5 years ago?" I continued, my voice hard. "You laughed at me for putting my small trust fund allowance into those fake internet coins and tech startups. You called it play money. You said I was throwing it away." Draven flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the first page, and the color drained from his face instantly. He looked like he was going to be sick. "It wasn't fake, Draven," I said, leaning back in the chair. "I put everything I had into Ethereum when it was under $10. I leveraged high-risk options on AI tech stocks like Nvidia 3 years ago when you were busy betting on horses. That play money is now worth more than this entire building." I slid a second paper across the table with the number 51% written on it. "I didn't just buy the company today. I've been buying shares through shell companies for 18 months. North Star Holdings? That's me. Blue Wave Capital? That's me. I already owned 40% of the voting stock before I walked in here this morning." I tapped the table with my finger right on the folder Draven was holding. "And this morning, I bought your debt. I own the bank loans you defaulted on last week, which means I have the right to seize assets. Effectively, I am the bank, and I am foreclosing on you." Draven stared at the document, his eyes scanning the lines over and over again. He was looking for a mistake, a joke, or a forgery. But the bank seals were authentic. The watermarks were real. He looked up at me, and I saw the exact moment the reality hit him. His arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, trembling man. The color returned to his face, but it was patchy and sickly. He dropped the folder and let out a breathless, shaky laugh. He unbuttoned his jacket and spread his arms wide, forcing a wide, gummy smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. "Radley, wow," he stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "I mean, wow. This is incredible, little brother. You really pulled a fast one on us, didn't you?" He chuckled, looking around the room for support, but the board members were staring at their shoes. He walked around the edge of the table, moving toward me with his hand extended. "Look, I know I was a little harsh earlier. It's just the stress of the deal, you know? But this is great news. We can keep it in the family. With your capital and my leadership experience, we can run this place together. Partners. 50-50. Just like Dad would have wanted, right?" I didn't shake his hand. I just watched him sweat. The silence stretched out until Draven slowly lowered his hand, his smile faltering. "Family?" I asked, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. "That is an interesting word choice, Draven." I stood up slowly. Draven took a quick step back, fear flickering in his eyes. 5 minutes ago, I wasn't family. 5 minutes ago, I was a mistake. I was a leech. I walked around the chair and leaned against the heavy table. 5 minutes ago, I was just the assistant who wasn't allowed to breathe the same air as your precious buyer. I looked past him to the board members. Mrs. Albright was clutching her pearls. Mr. Draycott looked like he wanted to dissolve into his chair. And now that you know I hold the checkbook, suddenly we are partners? I shook my head, a cold smile touching my lips. I don't think so. As the majority shareholder and owner of the debt, I have some serious concerns about the current leadership. Specifically, the CEO's inability to treat human beings with basic dignity. Draven's fake smile vanished instantly. His face hardened into a mask of pure spite. He realized the nice guy act wasn't going to work, so he switched back to greed. If he couldn't keep the power, he would take the money. Fine, he spat, buttoning his jacket aggressively. You want to play the big shot? Go ahead. Fire me. Take the company. It's a sinking ship anyway. I'll go to Monaco and laugh while you burn. He crossed his arms, looking smug. But you still have to honor the contract. My golden parachute clause is ironclad. If I am removed as CEO for any reason, I get a $10 million severance package. So write the check, Radley, and I'll get out of your face. I laughed. It was a genuine laugh this time, cold and sharp, the sound of a steel trap snapping shut. I looked at the Omega lawyer. Counselor, you drafted the employment addendum for the transition period. Could you please read Section 4, Paragraph C regarding termination for cause? The lawyer didn't need to look at the paper. He knew the language by heart. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with the dry, monotone precision of an executioner. Section 4, Paragraph C, the bad leaver provision. It states that the company may terminate the executive without severance pay if the executive engages in gross misconduct. He paused, glancing at the scattered papers on the floor, the evidence of Draven's earlier tantrum, then back at my brother. Gross misconduct is defined here as fraud, embezzlement, or any act of physical assault, verbal harassment, or abusive conduct directed toward any employee, contractor, or officer of the company. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my brother. You were so busy counting your millions that you forgot the basics, Draven. You don't get paid if you assault the staff. Draven's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. That's standard boilerplate. You can't enforce that over a dropped file. It's minor. You threw a 3-pound binder at my chest, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You screamed at me. You forced me to my knees in front of the entire board. And unfortunately for you, the new majority shareholder has a zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence. I am invoking Section 4. The lawyer nodded solemnly and closed the folder with a final thud. He is correct, Mr. Draven. The definition of cause has been met. The severance package is void. The payout is 0. The words hung in the air. 0. Draven made a sound like a wounded animal. His face turned a deep, violent red. No, he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. You can't do that. That's my money. I earned that. He lost all control. With a feral roar, he lunged across the corner of the table, his hands reaching for my throat. The board members shrieked. Mrs. Albright knocked over her coffee cup. But I didn't flinch. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed a single button. Now, before Draven could get within 3 feet of me, the double doors burst open. 2 massive security guards in dark uniforms, men I had hired personally that morning and stationed outside, stepped in. They grabbed Draven by the arms before he could touch me. He thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities, but they held him fast. I looked at my watch. You are trespassing on private property, Draven. Get out. The security guards dragged a screaming, kicking Draven out of the glass doors. His shouts echoed down the hallway. I'll sue you. I'll ruin you. Until the elevator doors finally dinged and silenced him. The boardroom was deathly quiet. The only sound was the rain hitting the glass. The board members looked terrified. They were waiting for the axe to fall on them next. They knew they had been complicit. They had watched the abuse for years and said nothing. I adjusted my cuffs and sat back down in the chairman's chair. I picked up the gold pen Draven had left on the table. With smooth, deliberate strokes, I signed the final page of the acquisition document as the new owner. I closed the folder and looked up at the table of nervous faces. Relax, I said, though my voice left no room for argument. I'm not going to fire you all today. But things are going to change. No more ego. No more bullying. We're going to build something real. I tapped the file on the table. Now, I said, getting to work. Let's clean up this mess.